When it comes to the Fast and Furious franchise, there are a lot of mixed thoughts about it, especially how it upped jumping the shark by jumping a submarine, or sending a car into space, which I have a lot to say about that scene. Trust me, there's so much to unpack from this moment. Well, I'll save it for another time. But before all that, it was a much simpler time taking on street gangs or drug lords rather than Avengers-level threats. The first movie featuring two main leads, Dominic Toretto, played by Vin Diesel, an actor with one of the most fitting last names to drive I've heard of since Speed Racer. And the topic of this video, Brian O'Connor, played by the late Paul Walker, who tragically passed in 2013 in an accident. The movie would be the start to a long-running series of movies, video games, and spin-offs. But in 2001, it was just known as The Fast and the Furious, a movie about action, espionage, and cars. Also family.
Family, 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 family.
Whereas the later movies are also about action, espionage, and cars. Also family. Except with world-ending stakes. At least this movie was more about the street races and stealing truckloads of DVD players. It's strange. After how far the series goes, that plot just seems so normal. As I was saying, the racing scene back in the early 2000s was a much smaller place, more of a niche hobby, but one still very active. And it's thanks to movies like this that made street racing become much more mainstream. See it as a similar effect the live-action Transformers movies had for the brand, for better or for worse. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of these cars helped inspire the tuners from the Cars movie. Brian O'Connor in this movie is a Los Angeles police officer working undercover under the alias
Brian Earl Spillner. Sounds like a serial killer name. Is that what you are?
No, man.
After the opening heist scene, we watch Brian driving a Kawasaki green-colored 1995 Mitsubishi Eclipse. Brian is practicing with the vehicle in an empty parking lot, pushing the car over 140 miles per hour, only to spin out right after. I get that this is just practice and not a real race, but in storytelling terms, this communicates a lot to the viewer. To understand what I mean, watch the opening to Initial D. We see an 8.6 moving fast down some mountain roads. The clips of the jangling keys, the footwork on the pedals, and the smooth shifting. It all comes to signal to the viewer that this is a skilled driver, and the mystery lies of who the identity of this racing ace could be, especially with someone who seemingly knows him passes by. So when the reveal happens, it becomes much more surprising, both for the other characters and the viewer.
My son Takami's delivering tofu to the hotels now.
With that in mind, look at this opening scene again closely. Brian can push the car to high speeds and drive the engine into the Redline, but he's not able to properly control the car. I don't doubt Brian has some understanding of how to maintain his Eclipse. Yes, properly tuning the car is also the driver's responsibility. Consider it as basic maintenance. And if you're not able to do so yourself, you have a skilled mechanic who helps do that for you. But you should still be aware of how your car performs. This is a big aspect of where Brian and Dom differ. We see all through the movie the type of drivers Dom hangs around with along with his crew, like the technical genius Jesse.
Man, you should be going to MIT or something.
Yeah, right.
But if it hasn't been made clear yet, then what really should reveal to you Brian's lack of skill was the movie's first race with the 10-second cars. A 10-second car refers to a race that competes in a quarter-mile drag race. It gets the naming from being 10 seconds or less. To put it into perspective, in order to cover a quarter mile in 10 seconds, the average speed would need to be 90 miles per hour. That's only if you're already at 90 when you start, meaning that when you take into consideration acceleration from 0, you would need to be going well over 120. This race features 4 drivers: Brian in his Eclipse, Danny Yamato in the white 1993 Honda Civic EJ, Edwin in the orange 1994 Acura Integra, and Dom in the red Mazda RX-7 FD. What you need to know is that when driving through mountain passes, it's rare when you have more than 2 drivers participating in a race because of how narrow the roads are. Not to mention how any wrong move could send you flying over the ledge.
He's going over that cliff!
However, in places like the US where the streets are generally much wider, it allows for races like this to take place with multiple cars, having more a focus on speed and horsepower rather than drifting capabilities. That's why you'd see more of these sort of drag races, as they also tend to be more accessible to newcomers in the racing scene. Speaking of, we see right off the bat, Brian couldn't even pull up to the starting line properly. This is embarrassing, like live-action Initial D movie Eatski levels of bad. The rest of the Red Sons would be laughing or groaning about how terrible his skills are. On the inside anyways, because we're not like the Night Kids. We keep things classy here. If we're going to embarrass someone, we post about it online so others can laugh instead. One might chalk it up to nerves as he has a pink slip entry. It's referred to as a pink slip because he's betting his car since he lacks the $2,000 entry for the pot.
Brian, don't lose that cool of yours. That's your meal ticket.
My meal ticket. Well, I can't pay for my own shrimp.
I got the shrimp.
I would cut him some slack if this was meant to be a psychological tactic to lower the defenses of the other racers, like showing up last minute for some dramatic entry, preventing your opponent from studying your warm-ups. But given the short nature of this type of race and against multiple others, that strategy wouldn't work as they'd be too busy focused on being first against one another to consider letting their guard down. We see Brian opens the valves on some tanks in the back. That's because before the race began, he asked his boss for some NOS or nitrous oxide, N2O, a real gas composition used to induce combustion in the engine to boost the car's speed. Think of it less like those Mario Kart mushrooms and more the F-Zero boost where it drains the health of the machine. We've covered how superchargers will burn the life of the engine. This alone could make your car a one and done. And that's if it doesn't go up in flames. That's how dangerous it is unless fine-tuned to perfection. And given he was already hard-pressed for time adding this setup in a single afternoon, well, it's impressive but doesn't bode much confidence. And that leads into another issue. Just because you have access to a type of setup or strategy doesn't mean others can't use similar tactics. Keep that in mind. Just like how we see Brian's rough driving skills come into play at the start of the movie, we see it again in his start-off. Not only is his reaction time the slowest amongst the four, but he nearly spins out just like those Mario Kart games. It's a very sloppy form all around, and even though he quickly recovers, it would set into motion how the rest of the race plays out. This slow start is why Brian needed to rely on his NOS boost so soon, and it was just enough to pass the Integra. Then his second boost is used to overtake Dom's FD. And as I alluded to earlier, just because you have access to a particular setup doesn't mean your opponent doesn't have something similar. Dom uses his trump card, utilizing his own boost, and wins the race. In racing, it's a lot more strategic than most people understand. It's almost like a game of chess, but moving at high speeds. It requires a lot of patience, self-control, and endurance. You can essentially learn everything about your opponent just by studying them from the rear. So being in first isn't always ideal in all situations. It's as long as you finish first that matters.
It don't matter if you win by an inch or a mile. Winning's winning.
In fact, revealing your secret weapon too soon is a recipe for disaster, especially if your opponent is skilled enough. Brian did manage to better control the eclipse compared to the opening scene since he was able to reach 160. I will say, he seemed to enjoy the experience. It's rare you can find someone lose such a competitive sporting event and keep a goofy grin.
Dude, I almost had you.
I suppose that's part of what made Brian's character so charming, even though he blew out his car in the process.
You never had.
Well, I guess it's Dom's car now. Or at least it was. Dom makes valid points. There were a lot of errors on Brian's part that ended up needlessly frying his car when it could have prevented had he been properly shifting, had a well-timed start, and didn't reveal his ace too soon.
Granny shifting, not double clutching like you should. You're lucky that 100 shot of NOS didn't blow the welds on the intake.
Before we move on, I know some of you watching that scene might also be confused at what exactly Dom was talking about, thinking it's just technobabble but with cars. In actuality, they are real driving terms. Granny shifting refers to the way one normally shifts gears in a manual transmission. Press on the clutch, shift, then slowly lift your foot off the clutch, like your grandparents used to do. It's a basic technique that everyone learning stick shift does because of how practical it is in daily driving. What Brian needed to do was power shifting, which allows for faster shifting without letting off the gas and is often used in drag races. But this requires a lot of skill and practice, otherwise you risk throwing out your gearbox. And replacing a manual transmission has always been pricey. Double clutching is another manual technique by using the clutch pedal twice during shifting for smoother engagement. This is especially useful when running into higher RPMs. This further adds to my point about Brian's lack of skill. Drag races are more complicated than strapping a rocket engine to your car and mashing the gas. Otherwise, even a trained monkey could do it. Timing is everything, and when all you have are 10 seconds or less going over 100 miles an hour, any mistake could be the deciding factor to victory or defeat. In terms of skill, Brian started out quite poorly at barely able to handle his car at high speeds and later blew out the manifolds. However, he was rapidly improving. Notice how in this race he was able to accelerate beyond 150 and still keep from spinning out. And by the next day, he pulls an Asakura, finds a junked-up car that's rusted and beat up on the outside but has amazing parts and engine under the hood. And much like the Devil Z, he and Dom's crew rebuild the car into the orange turbocharged 1994 Toyota Supra Mark IV. As a side note, this movie is one of Diesel's best acting in the franchise. He actually gives a performance that makes him seem like a real person and can actually be understood, especially when talking about the tragic backstory about his father, Jack Toretto.
I watched my dad burn to death. I remembered hearing him scream.
Over the next couple of days, Brian gets closer to the Toretto family, especially with Dom's sister, Mia, while he continues to balance his professional life as an undercover cop and as a street racer. He suspects Johnny Tran and his motorcycle gang are responsible for the hijackings of the stolen equipment, only for a SWAT raid to reveal it wasn't them. This incident sets up the course of the rest of the movie. By this point, something strange happens. As he test drives the Supra against a 1995 Ferrari F355 Spider in an impromptu race. It's here we see a different side of Brian, a more competent and fearless driver. Dom sees something in him too. Later, we see Brian and Dom hang out getting something to eat. It's here Brian presses Dom for the side hustle he's got going.
I know there's no way in hell you paid for all that shit that's under the hood of those cars by doing tune-ups and selling groceries. Now, whatever it is you're in on, I want in on it too.
You couldn't look more like a cop than now, even if you had on a police cap, badge, and flashing lights. So to test the waters, Dom invites Brian to Race Wars, a huge racing event where people all over get to drag race for all sorts of stakes, mainly money. We'll chalk up Brian's desperation due to the short time limit. Otherwise, he'll be fired if he doesn't find out the real criminals. Due to Jesse's panic after losing a pink slip race, we don't get to see Brian racing in the Supra. Again, revealing your trump card too soon can lead to defeat. Johnny confronts Dom about getting Jesse's car, then also accuses Toretto of being responsible for the SWAT raid.
It was you!
Shortly after, it's revealed Dominic's crew are the hijackers, but this time the trucker came prepared. Dom's crew finds out what happens when you mess with Bay vs. Optimus.
Time to find out.
Yes, Dom and his crew were entirely the villains of the earlier movies. The truck driver was well within his right to defend himself, and if it were any other type of movie, he could have easily been seen as a protagonist. Things reach a boiling point when Brian blows his cover to help save Vince's life.
Yeah, this is Officer Brian O'Connor.
Later, he stops Dom from going out to look for Jesse, given he's doing so with a shotgun, only for Jesse to return and subsequently shot up in retaliation by Tran and his cousin. Like how they did Brian's Eclipse, Jesse doesn't survive this. By the time the final act happens, Brian seems a lot more competent behind the wheel, especially having to dodge bullets from Johnny Tran on a motorcycle. It always has to be a motorcycle. You can't trust them. You hear that, Keisuke? Never trust a motorcycle gang. In any case, after Tran and his cousin have been, let's say, put out of commission,
Retire!
we get to the final race of Brian versus Dom in another 10-second race. It's here we see Brian is able to have a clean start. Yes, he does lag behind Dom's supercharged 1970 Dodge Charger RT. This supercharged machine carries a lot under the hood that its front raised up like a dragster. To those asking if this would slow down his speed not having the wheels on the ground. No, because this Charger is a rear-wheel drive. And as we've covered previously, that means all the traction and power takes place in the rear wheels, and the front are just used for steering. What makes the scene impressive is the showcase of JDM versus American Muscle in a drag race, how one has a clear natural advantage over the other. A topic I'll go into another time. Adding more tension to the race, a train makes its way towards the finish line. It's a do-or-die moment, and like the race against the Ferrari, we see that Brian won't back down no matter how crazy it looks to be. Brian's use of NOS has been far more optimized. Not just because of how the Supra is put together. He uses it once, pauses for a few moments, then uses it again as the two pass the oncoming train. Here's a fun fact. Did you know Brian is the one who comes out winning this race? If you look over the footage frame by frame, you can see that not only was Brian's Supra the first to touch the crossing gate, you can see in the side view how the Supra beats the Charger, even if neither of the two realized a clear winner. But just when it all seemed in the clear, Dom ends up crashing into a truck and flipping over the Supra. I really hope it's not explained later on that this was Jacob, Dom's long-lost brother, out for revenge. Thankfully, that never happened. Brian ends up giving Dom the keys to the Supra to make up for the Eclipse that Tran's group destroyed. This allows Dom to escape from the authorities, marking Brian as a wanted man. and the movie ends, at least for Brian's side, as we see Dom successful in his escape. But you can see now why Brian O'Connor with the Eclipse was terrible at driving, and the setup he had on his car should have been maintained to better handle the high stresses for longer than just a one-time use. So pretty much was as skilled as your average street racer, eventually becoming a very skillful and talented driver, winning races across the country. I suppose the real secret to good driving was the family we made along the way, or whatever was in those sandwiches.
What'd you put in that sandwich?
Stick with us as we cover Brian's continued growth in the sequel. Please like, subscribe, and let us know which character from the Fast and Furious franchise you want to see covered next. Remember, keep those engines roaring, a quarter mile at a time.